Good morning, students. So today we'll start with where we left off last time. So we were discussing about non-communicable diseases. So next disease is actually so last class we discussed about cancer. So today we are going to discuss about HIV and AIDS. Okay. So HIV and AIDS, it is not so though it is communicable, but it is actually how do I put it exactly? So it's a non-communicable disease, but it doesn't exactly spread from touch, okay, or any physical agents. So we'll see what are the modes of transmission. So HIV stands for human immunodeficiency virus. So it detects, it infects only human beings, and it's transmitted between humans, but not from animals. So it is not transmitted from bites of mosquitoes, bats, or any other species. Also, a person suffering from HIV has inability to fight against diseases. That is because the immune system becomes deficient. Okay. In a few slides we'll learn why does it actually become deficient. AIDS stands for acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. So initially when it was discovered, it was found that it is not inherited, which basically means that it cannot be transmitted from one generation to another generation. But later we found that actually infected mothers could transmit it to the children. Okay. So it is transmitted to a healthy person by an infected person. So it weakens the immune system. How does it do so? It creates a deficiency of our helper T cells. You remember helper T cells were those cells that actually helped our lymphocytes to transform into plasma cells and produce antibodies. So these helper T cells, they actually have a receptor called CD4 receptor. Okay, that is one of the receptors to which the virus binds. Okay. So this CD4 receptor, so it is called CD4 positive because these T cells, they actually express the CD4 receptors. So these are the T cells which the virus destroys, and the immune system because of them becomes compromised. Okay. So the humoral immunity is hampered. Okay. Next comes so we refer to it as syndrome because there are a lot more diseases involved. It's a collection of different diseases. Okay. Now coming to strains of HIV. So basically HIV was transferred to a human from their non-human primates. Okay. So primates in West Central Africa, they transferred it to humans in the early part of 20th century. So there are two strains of HIV, HIV-1 and HIV-2. HIV-1 is more pathogenic and has a global distribution, and HIV-2 is less pathogenic and is less prevalent. Okay, it's distributed in Western Africa only. So next coming to structure of HIV. So HIV is actually, it has a spherical shape and is approximately 100 nanometer in diameter. So this is composed of a viral capsid. So if you see this here, the one in brown is actually light brown, is the viral capsid. Capsid is nothing but a layer made of proteins. Okay. So then this is the protein capsid, and then so inside the capsid lies the RNA, okay, the single stranded RNA, which is again covered with nucleocapsid. Okay. Then this RNA actually, so on the outside the protein capsid, so there's this lipid layer. Okay. So it is enveloped by a layer of lipid. Okay. And on the lipid, so there are different glycoproteins, transmembrane glycoproteins present, which appear as spikes on the surface of the virus. Okay. So these are actually there are two parts to this glycoprotein receptors. So there is one GP41, which is actually the transmembrane part, and then there is GP120, which is actually the docking glycoprotein. So this GP120 interacts with the CD4 receptors present on the T cells. Okay. This however occasionally, so what else does the virus contain? So it contains a reverse transcriptase. Now because this is a single stranded RNA virus, we need this RNA to first convert into DNA. Okay. That's why transcription is formation of RNA from DNA. Now reverse transcription is formation of DNA from RNA. Okay. And then we have integrase, because this is a retrovirus, because it carries RNA as nuclear material, it needs to integrate its genome into the genome of the host. Okay, so that's why it needs a specialized protein called integrase. Then it contains a few proteases and host proteins. So this proteases are we'll see when they are necessary. Okay, in the next slide. So yeah, also occasionally these may contain this MHC proteins. Okay, so these are also present on the immune cells of our immune system. Okay, so for coming to the life cycle of HIV, so each replication cycle of HIV lasts for 1 to 2 days. Okay, so let's see the first step. So first step is binding. Now once the virus enters the body, it has to go to the helper T cells and bind there. Okay, so it attaches itself to the T cells by using this the glycoprotein GP41 and GP120. Okay, so this connect with receptor on the with the CD4 receptor on the surface of the T cell. Okay, so after it attaches itself to this T cell receptor, which is the CD4 receptor, it needs to again attach itself to another receptor present on the surface of the T cell, which is the CCR5 co-receptor. Okay, co-receptor because it needs to bind to both of this receptor in order to be internalized. Okay, so next step is fusion. So after it has successfully it has been bound to both your CD4 receptors and CCR5 receptors. The virus is now adsorbed to the surface of the cell and can be absorbed into the main body of the cell. Okay, so as this happens, if you see in the diagram, the virus actually loses its lipid envelope. Okay, so what enters inside is actually the capsid. Okay, the protein capsid, which contains the nucleic acid. Okay, so eventually the capsid is lost and our RNA is exposed in the cytoplasm of the cell. So here the enzyme, so along with your capsid, along with the nucleic acid, actually your integrase and reverse transcriptase is also liberated into the cytoplasm. Okay, so this reverse transcriptase, the third step is reverse transcription. So this actually acts on the single stranded RNA and converts it into a double stranded DNA to fit in with the human DNA. Okay, so next step is integration. Integration basically means that the double stranded viral DNA would now be integrated into the genome of the host cell. Okay, so that it can successfully replicate itself as well as it can produce RNA. So the next step is actually replication and transcription. So while the host, see, the question is why does it integrate itself with the host genome? That is because it lacks the cellular machinery required for DNA replication. Okay, so once it's integrated into the host genome, the machinery of the host genome will actually replicate it, and when the time is right for it, it will just excise itself from the DNA, excise itself from the genome of the host. Okay, but it doesn't usually do that. So simultaneously, along with the replication of DNA, the transcription goes on and viral mRNAs are produced. Okay, which are then transported to the cytoplasm where the viral proteins are encoded. So now once we have all the proteins necessary for which the virus requires actually, then happens the assembly. Okay, so basically the viral mRNA is actually pretty long and the proteins formed need to be chopped off, okay, cleaved off into smaller proteins. So this is actually carried out by the protease that we saw was present in the virus. Okay, so now once everything is done, this virus is actually assembled anew. The newly synthesized viruses are assembled, and then the last step is budding. So these viruses needs to be released into the exterior. Okay, how would they do so? Because they are right now confined in the T cell, so they actually lyse the T cell. Okay, they totally destroy the membrane and then they are thus released. So by killing the T cell, actually they are able to be released into the cytoplasm, not cytoplasm, the extracellular matrix, where they can actually from where they would spread throughout the body, and then they would go on infecting other T cells. Okay, so this continuous process happens millions of times a day. Okay, so the newly released viruses are called virions, and they go on to infect new CD4 T cells. Okay, to repeat the process again and again. Now coming to transmission of HIV. So the person to person spread of HIV is called as HIV transmission. So this transmission can happen only through specific activities such as sex or injection through injection of drugs. Okay, it can be transmitted from a HIV infected individual only through certain body fluids such as your blood, semen, preseminal fluids, rectal fluids or vaginal fluids. Okay, then HIV transmission is only possible only if these fluids come in contact with the mucous membrane of the healthy individual. Okay, a mucous membrane or any damaged tissue. Okay, and are directly injected into the bloodstream either from a needle or a syringe. So mucous membranes are found everywhere in the rectum, in the vagina, in the opening of penis and in the mouth. HIV can also spread from so this was discovered later, that it can also spread from a infected mother to the child through during either childbirth or during breastfeeding. Okay, so this kind of transmission is called mother to child transmission of HIV. Also one cannot get HIV from direct from a casual contact with a person who has HIV. So handshake or hug or closed mouth kisses won't lead to transmission of HIV. Also by using the objects that the HIV infected persons use, such as toilet seats or doorknobs or dishes, so HIV cannot be transmitted that way. Okay. Now coming to the infection. Okay, what happens once the HIV virus has entered the body? Okay, so the disease progression happens in 3 stages. First is the acute infection, second is the chronic HIV infection, which is also known as the clinical latency. We'll see why it is known as it. And then the third stage or the final stage is the manifestation of a complex variety of symptoms called as AIDS. Okay, so first coming to acute infection. So this generally develops within 2 to 4 weeks after the infection with HIV. So during this period, people have flu-like symptoms such as fever, headache and rash. That is exactly why, because the symptoms are not so drastic, people usually neglect it. Okay, then in this phase, the virus actually replicates. I mean, the multiplies rapidly and spreads throughout the body. So there is a very progressive decline in the number of CD4 cells in the immune system. Okay, also because the viral load is very high during this acute infection, the chances of spreading, okay, or the chances of transmission of HIV during this period is very high. Okay, which greatly increases the risk of transmission. Also now we'll see later what is an antiretroviral therapy. This is basically the treatment regimen used. So this when started during acute infection. So let's just say a person suspects to have acquired or to have contracted HIV. So if the HIV is actually detected and the person starts the antiretroviral therapy, then there are significant health benefits to it. Okay, so HIV, the disease progression can be curbed at a very early stage. Next is the chronic HIV infection. So here what happens is, so during this period actually the virus continues to multiply in the body, but the rate is very slow. Okay, now because of this, what happens is that the person becomes asymptomatic. So the person doesn't manifest any symptoms that would give away the fact that the person is harboring the HIV. Okay, then yeah, so without any antiretroviral therapy, so this HIV infection, it advances to AIDS in almost 10 years. Okay, also if people are immune deficiency or they have other health complication, it may advance faster. Also for people who are taking antiretroviral therapy, it may take decades for the for it to actually reach the stage of AIDS. Okay, so so even though there's still a chance that during this time the person can actually transmit HIV to other persons, people who take antiretroviral therapy, okay, have significantly reduced viral load in the blood, and they actually pose no risk to transmit HIV to other HIV negative partners. Okay, now coming to AIDS. So AIDS is the final and most severe stage of HIV infection. Now, because the CD4, the helper T cells have been almost destroyed. Okay, so before that, let me come to this point, that people are said to have AIDS only when their CD4 count is less than 200 cells per cubic millimeter of blood. Okay, that is the standard criteria. So people with people in the stage of AIDS are actually characterized by a CD4 count less than 200 cells per cubic millimeter of blood. Now this actually means that the number of CD4 cells has significantly decreased, okay, and the humoral immunity part is actually lacking. So what because of this deficiency in the immune system, the infections, other infections, secondary infections are able to infect or harbor themselves in the body, okay, manifest themselves in the body. Also now because the immune system has been compromised, various cancers can actually occur more frequently. Okay, so these infections are actually known as the opportunistic infections, because they take the opportunity of a weakened immune system. Okay, then so these in the stage of AIDS, people have a high infected people have a high viral load and are able to transmit HIV to others easily. Okay, so without treatment, people with AIDS usually survive for 3 years. Okay, so coming to symptoms of AIDS, what are the symptoms by which you can identify? Rapid weight loss, recurring fever or profuse night sweats, extreme unexplained tiredness, prolonged swelling of lymph glands in the armpits, growing or neck region, diarrhea that lasts more than a week, sores of the mouth, anus or genitals, then pneumonia, red, brown or purplish blotches under the skin or inside the mouth, okay, and memory loss, depression. Okay, so by this it can be identified. Also now coming to the treatment of AIDS. Okay, how is it treated, or how is HIV infection treated? So the drug used for this purpose is called antiretroviral therapy, antiretroviral drugs, ART in short, and the treatment regimen is called antiretroviral therapy. So the drugs actually fall into 6 main classes. Okay, so the first is nucleotide. So because we know that reverse transcription is involved in the process, so one of the targets, drug targets, is to inhibit the reverse transcriptase. So there are 2 types of reverse transcriptase inhibitors. One is the nucleoside or nucleotide reverse transcriptase inhibitors, okay, referred to as NRTIs, which actually would bind and which would go and bind to the reverse transcriptase, then upon phosphorylation would inhibit it. Okay, so the example is abacavir. And then there are non-nucleoside reverse transcriptase inhibitors, which have a completely different binding site on the enzyme, and they can just, without any phosphorylation event, they can inhibit the enzyme. Okay, example is doravirine. Then there are integrase inhibitors. So integrase is again an important part of the integrant, an important enzyme actually, or important protein actually, which would actually go and facilitate the integration of genomic and viral DNA. Okay, so that is again targeted. So the example is elpidoprid. Then there are entry inhibitors. So we know that to enter the host, the virus needs to attach itself to the CD4 receptors. Okay, so then there are entry inhibitors which would inhibit the entry of the virus into the cell. Then there are protease inhibitors. Now protease is required to chop off the polypeptide into smaller fragments, which can be packaged to form new viruses. Okay, now the example of protease inhibitor is lopanavir. And then there are post attachment inhibitors. We know that just attachment to CD4 receptors won't do the job. It needs to associate with the co-receptor, which is CCR5. Okay, so this so this drug ibalizumab, so this actually inhibits the association of GP120 with the CCR5 receptor. Okay, now each of these drugs has a very specific way of acting in the body. Okay, specific mode of action. Now usually these drugs are not individually given, but a combination of these drugs or a cocktail of these drugs are given. Okay, so they would often comprise of this nucleotide reverse transcriptase inhibitors, then combined with an integrase inhibitor or a non-nucleoside reverse transcript inhibitor or a protease inhibitor. Okay, so this kind of therapy is called as triple therapy. Now there are ways to administer it. So there are single tablet regimens where there are fixed dosage pills which contain the combination of all of them, and this is to be taken once a day. Then there are some booster drugs. So what booster drugs basically are used when protease inhibitors are used. So booster drugs actually, see, once the nascent drug is able to enter the body, the liver can break it down very rapidly. But when you coat it with a booster drug, okay, you give a secondary drug, so the liver actually would take time to, it first has to break down the booster drug and only then it can reach the primary drug. Okay, so it will take a longer time, so the drug will be retained in the body for a longer time. Okay, the primary drug would basically be ineffective without the booster drug. Now coming to basics of HIV prevention. So it requires sterilization of all surgical instruments before use, then subjecting blood to HIV testing before blood transfusion. Okay, then HIV positive women should try to avoid pregnancy because the child is always at a potential risk of getting the disease, getting the infection. Then choosing less risky sexual behaviors by not having multiple sexual partners and using condoms. Then disposable injections can be used for every injection being used, and the used injection should be discarded, okay, after only single usage. Okay, so there are government organizations that create awareness among the people about HIV. So these are National AIDS Control Board, National AIDS Committee, and National AIDS Control Organization. Okay. Now coming to HIV prevention. Can HIV be prevented? The answer is yes, to some extent. So there are different drugs available which can be taken as a prophylaxis to prevent HIV. So the first one is PrEP, which stands for pre-exposure prophylaxis. So this is a pill that can be taken once a day and can prevent HIV. So this has to be taken every day. So you break the continuity. If you skip drugs, skip the tablets, it won't work. Okay, and this is not for everybody. This is especially for people who are at a high risk of contracting the disease. Okay, so this can also be given to the baby to avoid getting the infection from the mother. Okay, so if used correctly, PrEP can lower the chances of getting HIV from sex by more than 90%, and by sharing needles by 70%. Okay, so this does not prevent other sexually transmitted diseases like gonorrhea and chlamydia. So this goes by the brand name Truvada. Okay, then there's PEP. Okay, PEP is post exposure prophylaxis. So it's a series of pill one can start taking after being exposed to HIV that lowers the chances of getting HIV. So once you have a suspicion that you have been exposed, so you have to start it as soon as possible. Okay, and it has to be started within the window of 72 hours. So every hour is important. The sooner you start, the less chances of getting HIV. Okay, so this is PEP is for emergencies only. Okay, so this cannot be a replacement of using condoms, or it cannot replace the PrEP as a substitute. Okay, next we'll talk about vaccines. Okay, so now that we have, we saw that HIV transmission has from one infected individual to other has a very different mode than what is actually categorized as a communicable disease. Okay, that is why HIV infection, HIV transmission is a non-communicable disease. Okay, though it is infected, it does not use the standard means that communicable diseases use. Okay, now let's talk about vaccines. So we have studied about immune system, we have idea about communicable diseases and non-communicable diseases. Let's talk about vaccines. So a vaccine is a preparation of bacterial, viral or other pathogenic agents or their isolated antigens, okay, or its components, which is administered with the objective of stimulating the recipient's immunity, okay, producing more B and T lymphocytes. Now, what are the different kinds of vaccines available? The first one is natural live vaccines. So this includes giving non-pathogenic organisms to the individual, okay. Examples are cowpox vaccine, simian vaccine, bovine retroviral vaccines. So when vaccines were first invented, that was when this natural live vaccines were given. So now these live vaccines are no longer used. So next comes live attenuated vaccines. So what is this term attenuation? Attenuation is a process by which the virulence of the bacteria or the virus is weakened. How is it done? So they are basically infected to a organism which actually cannot, which they cannot infect, okay, and they are subjected, they are forced to replicate inside the body of such an organism. So because of which what happens that they gradually lose their virulence, okay. Now these attenuated microbes, they usually do not cause diseases. However, there is a chance that they can revert back to their pathogenic form, okay. That risk is always there. Like I said, everything has to be weighed in terms of their benefits and the risks involved, okay. So the benefit outweighs the risks. The example is, the most popular vaccine is the BCG or Bacillate Calmette Guerin vaccine, which is used against tuberculosis. Then some other attenuated vaccines are used against polio, yellow fever and measles. Next, coming to inactivated vaccines. So when in case of live attenuated vaccines, the microorganism was attenuated. Here what happens is that by using heat or other chemicals, the pathogen's ability to replicate is completely destroyed, okay. But because the pathogen is still intact, it can still evoke a immune response in the body, okay. So these sort of vaccines are referred to as inactivated vaccines. So because the pathogen is inactivated or killed because of the heat, so it cannot revert back to its pathogenic form, okay, and is comparatively a safer vaccine. So the side effect, not side effect exactly, the shortcoming is that it is only effective for a short period of time, okay. So this has to be administered at regular intervals to maintain the protection against it, okay, to maintain the immune status. So example is Salk polio vaccine and whooping cough. Now coming to toxoid vaccines. Now many times what happens is that especially these bacterial diseases, so the entire bacteria is not what causes the disease, but actually a product, a toxin released by the bacteria, that is responsible for the disease, okay. So like diphtheria and tetanus bacilli, they produce endotoxins that induce symptoms associated with the disease. Now these endotoxins are taken, they are modified, okay, such that they lose their toxicity, and then these are again the immunizations are created against it, okay. So basically these are now called toxoids, and now these toxoids when administered into the body can actually kill or inactivate inside the body, can actually evoke a immune response, okay. So these are toxoid vaccines. The examples, like I said, was diphtheria and tetanus bacilli. Next comes polysaccharide vaccines. So like the name suggests, polysaccharide vaccines is actually a unique vaccine that is composed of long chains of sugar molecules that make up the surface capsule of certain bacteria, okay. So this consists only of the sugars. Now this is actually a very effective vaccine, because this actually can directly stimulate the production of antibodies without the involvement of the helper T cells, okay. So this is helper T cell independent. The examples are Haemophilus, use of Haemophilus influenza and Streptococcus pneumoniae, okay. So these vaccines are used against them. Now coming to live vector vaccines. So by the term vector we mean the agent that carries the disease, okay. So the desired gene coding for a target antigen is joined to a suitable vector, which can be an attenuated bacteria or a virus. So this is then inoculated in the individual inside whom we want to generate the immunity, okay. So this vector replicates slowly inside the body, and along with it the said antigen replicates and it's presented to the immune system, and the whole process of immunization happens. So the commonly used viral vectors are smallpox, adenovirus, and the bacteria that are commonly used as Salmonella typhi, BCG strain of Mycobacterium bovis, and Vibrio cholerae. Okay. Next, coming to recombinant vaccines. So here what happens is that by using this recombinant DNA technology, a gene that codes for this antigen can actually be introduced. So these are actually artificially, these are cultured in laboratory, okay, and the antigenic protein is harvested. Okay, so gene codes for protein, right? So this protein is this gene is expressed in the laboratory, and these proteins are harvested, antigenic proteins. Okay, so this proteins are then given to the individuals for generating immunity. Examples are hepatitis B and human papilloma virus, okay, and influenza, and one of the brands of influenza virus. Okay. Then the next kind of vaccine is DNA vaccine. So here what happens is that this gene that encodes for the antigen is put in a plasmid, okay, which is then directly put in the body of a non-immunized human being, so that the virus, so that the plasmid can replicate, and then it can lead to production of the antigen. Okay, so this introduction to the non-immunized person can either be done intramuscularly, where it is directly given in the skeletal muscles, or it can be done intradermally, where it is directly delivered to the extracellular spaces. Okay, so this antigen, when is exposed in the cells, leads to both humoral immunity as well as cell mediated immune responses. Okay, the example is actually this Zika virus vaccine, which was prepared by this NIH, National Institute of Health, in 2016, and it is actually it is under trials. So now that we have talked about vaccines, okay, let's talk about the last topic under this chapter, which is adolescence. Okay, now adolescence is a period of transition between childhood and adulthood, marked by physical and psychological changes in the body. Okay. Often there are two terms which are interchangeably used, puberty and adolescence. However, there is a remarkable difference between both of them. Okay, so puberty refers to the biological process of physical changes by which an individual reaches the sexual maturity, okay, and becomes capable of reproduction. So this can begin independent of adolescence. Okay, so this is basically described in terms of physiological changes. But adolescence, it actually refers to a period of time, usually between childhood and adulthood, usually comprising of the teen years. Okay, so this will most certainly overlap with puberty. Okay, but still this is distinct from puberty, because this is mostly described in terms of physiological, the psychological and sociological terms. Okay, next, coming to the physical changes. So what are the physical changes that happen during puberty, during adolescence? So these are increase in height, accusation of muscle mass, and the distribution of body fat, and the development of secondary sexual characteristics. Okay, which leads to sexual dimorphism in humans. Okay, so underlying this physical changes are a wide spectrum of endocrine changes, hormonal changes. Okay, specifically the gonadarch and the andriarch. Okay, where these hormones, the hormones required for sexual development of sexual secondary characteristics, are actually produced by the body. Okay, and lead to gonadal maturation and production of sex steroids. Then there's growth spurt because of the growth hormones in the body. Okay, so this usually happens mid adolescence. Okay, and is regulated by complex number of hormones. So it takes place earlier in the girls, and it takes place later in the boys. Okay, then specifically hormonal changes in that of oxytocin and vasopressin results in how adolescents interact with others. So these different changes can actually be influenced by a lot of factors, which are chronic illness and undernutrition, and external factors such as stress within the family. Okay, and the similar factors can affect the boys and girls differently. For example, in case we talk about body mass index, so body mass index is actually higher for girls in early puberty and is delayed in boys. Okay, so later in the later years, this body mass, so boys have a higher body mass index. Okay, then coming to neurodevelopmental changes. Okay, so even though these are dependent, these are linked to hormonal changes, but these are not always dependent on them. Okay, so these what are the developments? So these takes place in the region of the brain such as the limbic system, which is responsible for pleasure seeking and response processing, reward processing, then emotional responses and sleep regulation. Okay, the reason why this adolescents feel an urge to explore and find things that give them pleasure, and then they have sleeping problems as well. And at the same time, so there are changes in the prefrontal cortex, which is the area responsible for executive functions such as decision making, organization, impulse control, and planning for the future. Okay, so the changes in the prefrontal cortex occur later than the changes in the limbic system. Okay, so so this does not suggest that the young adolescent people are not capable of decision making. This is just to say that also, apart from this point, there's also this point that the physical changes actually occur first and these changes occur later. So what happens, there's actually this there's a disconnect between the adolescents' physical capacities and their emotional capacities. Okay, now this, because of this disconnect, actually some of the risk behaviors and associated health problems increase. Okay, but these are not so this is not experienced by every adolescent out there. So this is limited to a fewer number of adolescents. Okay, next comes the psychological changes. So these are actually changes that increase the cognitive and intellectual capacity of the individual. Now over a course of second decade, so in their second decade of life, so they develop stronger reasoning skills, logical and moral thinking, then become more capable of abstract thinking and making rational judgments. So they also take into account other people's perspectives. Okay, then at the same time they are actually developing a sense of self. Okay, so so they are actually finding out more about their sexual identity. Okay, so they are concerned about other people's opinions, especially the opinion of their peers. Okay, then they want greater independence and responsibility. Okay, so because of this they tend to disengage themselves from parental control. Okay, then the social and cultural environment in which the adolescent is growing also plays an important role. Okay, so these adolescents are particularly vulnerable when they are still at the when they are still developing all these cognitive and intellectual capabilities, and at the same time they are trying to move away from their parents. Okay, so this may lead to taking decisions that range from who they spend time with and what they eat. Okay, and this basically would lead to acquiring a good or a bad company and then developing good habits or bad habits such as alcohol consumption and usage of drugs. Okay, so alcohol abuse and alcoholism is a pattern of drinking too much alcohol and too often. Okay, people, why do they actually use alcohol? So that could be due to due to social pressure, a desire to relax, to find a coping mechanism for anxiety, depression or tension, loneliness, self-doubt or unhappiness, or a family history behind using alcohol. Okay, so people who abuse alcohol drink too much on occasion, and their drinking habits are often they often result in risky behavior and poor judgment. However, alcohol abuse, frequent alcohol abuse would actually lead to physical dependency on alcohol and would thus lead to alcoholism. Okay, so it is distinct. Alcohol abuse is distinct from alcoholism. So alcoholism means that the person needs alcohol to get through the day. Okay. Now, what are the symptoms of alcohol abuse and alcoholism? So the alcohol abusers, they drink to relax. Okay, so they drive under the influence of alcohol. So they have problems, often social problems because of drinking, neglecting responsibilities, and having legal problems because of their habits. Whereas the symptoms of alcoholism, they include a strong desire or craving to drink. Okay, inability to control those cravings, inability to stop drinking, and increased tolerance for alcohol. So more and more they consume alcohol, their tolerance increases. So to reach the same level of intoxication, they need more and more alcohol. Then lying about drinking, then attempting to drink without others knowing. Okay, and then inability to get through everyday activities without drinking. Okay, now let's talk about the effects of alcohol. So the effects of alcohol are many. So first is the shrinking brain. So it has been shown that long term exposure to alcohol basically leads to shrinking of the brain. Then blackout. So there would be times when your memory formation would be hampered and you won't retain the events, okay, prior to returns that happens post drinking. Then dependence. It starts, you start physically depending on the liquor. Then heart damage, liver damage, pancreatitis, the inflammation, the disease of pancreas. Then behavioral changes, hallucinations. Often upon drinking, people hallucinate, okay, see things which are not there. Then slurred speech. It can also lead to cancer of the mouth, esophagus. Okay, then lung infections. Okay, fatigue, then frequent diarrhea, infertility. Okay, sexual dysfunction, malnutrition, diabetes complications, numbness, stomach distress, birth defects. Especially pregnant women are prohibited from consuming alcohol during their during the period that they carry, okay, the child, okay, because it leads to birth defects in the offspring born. Then thinning of bones, then changes in coordination and muscle cramps. Okay, so these are the common effects of alcohol. Next, let's talk about drug abuse. Okay, so drug essentially is the chemical used for the treatment of diseases under the supervision of a physician and is withdrawn after the desired effects are achieved. Okay. However, when under unsupervised conditions, prolonged and unnecessary usage of these drugs makes a person dependent on them and leads to addiction. Okay, so this is drug addiction, and the disorder that the person expresses are called the addictive disorders. Okay, so why do people take drugs basically? So if a drug fulfills a valuable need, then relying on it increases. So that could be drugs can be taken to calm or energize self, to make oneself more confident, to relieve pain, to cope up with panic attacks, to improve concentration at school and work. Then also under peer pressure, just to fit in the environment, fit in socially, people feel pressurized to take drugs, and once they are taking it, repeatedly taking them would lead to a dependency on it. Okay, now let's talk about the different classes of drugs which are there. So the first class is sedatives and tranquilizers. So these drugs have a calming effect on the body. Okay, so sedatives are prescribed for acute anxiety, tension and sleep disorders, and are used to induce and maintain anesthesia. The examples are barbiturates and are prescription sedatives or sleeping pills. Tranquilizers are used for anxiety, acute stress reactions and panic attacks. Okay, so the examples are benzodiazepines. So because all of them work by slowing the brain's activities, the individual actually when the individual stops taking them, so there can be a rebound effect. Okay, possibly leading to, because it is calming the brain, so it can lead to rebound effects where there are seizures and other consequences. Okay, now the individual also develops a tolerance to the drugs, which means that larger doses are required to achieve the similar effects as those that were experienced initially. So this may lead to drug overdose. Okay, now the next category of drug is stimulants. So these stimulants work by acting on the nervous system, central nervous system, to increase alertness and cognitive function. Now how do these work? These work by increasing the amount of neurotransmitters as dopamine and norepinephrine in the brain. So these chemicals, increase in these chemicals actually improves concentration and decreases fatigue. So basically these stimulants induce euphoria, decreased appetite, wakefulness, talkativeness, energy, increased concentration, difficulty in sleeping, nervousness, increased pulse and blood pressure. So stimulants actually produce an overabundance of dopamine, the pleasure seeking chemical in the brain. So what happens is that, each time you are taking the stimulants, you need more and more quantity actually to for the body to produce the normal amount of dopamine, okay, that it has been conditioned to. Now when the person stops taking this, they experience withdrawal symptoms. Okay, we'll talk about withdrawal symptoms in details in a few slides. Now what are the examples of stimulants? Caffeine, which is present in your coffee, then cocaine and amphetamines. Okay, the next class of drug is called hallucinogens, because they alter a person's awareness of their surroundings, okay, and make them see things which are not there. Okay, so these are there are two categories of hallucinogens. There are classic hallucinogens that actually cause hallucinations, and then there are dissociative drugs which create hallucinogens, create hallucinations, but actually additionally they feel the users to have a out of body experience. Okay, so the person feels disconnected from the body and feels like he or she is traveling in a different realm. Okay, then the examples are actually LSD, which is LSD is the abbreviation of L-lysergic acid diethylamide, and this is one of the most powerful classical hallucinogens found. Okay, so this is found in a fungus that is that grows on rye and other grains. So this has other street names including yellow, including dots and mellow yellow. Okay, and then there is PCP, which is phencyclidine, which is a type of dissociative drug. So this was basically discovered as an anesthetic, but because of the side effects, this was actually discarded, and this found usage as a drug which people started abusing. Okay, so this causes a out of body experience. So this has different names such as angel dust, hog, boat love and peace pill. The next type of drug is opiate narcotics. So opiates are basically painkillers, okay, medically prescribed to manage pain in individuals. So so these work on nervous system, and they slow down body functioning and reduce the physical and psychological pain. So the different drugs are codeine, morphine, dicyclocodone, methadone, oxycontin, hydrocodone and heroin. Okay, so these are created from the flowers of the opium poppy and has been used for hundreds of years to treat pain, diarrhea and sleeplessness. So what happens when you take opiate for a longer period of time? So this actually prevents the body from producing the natural opiates, which are the endorphins. Okay, so this leads so when you stop taking this opiates, so the individual experiences a lot of pain, high amount of pain when they try to quit it. The Now let's talk about withdrawal symptoms. So these drugs are like actually these suppress the production of neurotransmitters in your brain. Basically they are all working on your nervous system, so they decompress your brain, or they act like a they act so they push your brain down like a spring. Okay, so when you stop using drugs, so and the weight you take the weight of the spring, the brain rebounds by producing a surge of adrenaline. Okay, so there are two types of withdrawal symptoms. So first is the physical withdrawal symptoms, which is actually caused by alcohol, opiates and tranquilizers. And then there are drugs which create little physical withdrawal but more emotional withdrawal symptoms, which are basically the drugs here are cocaine, marijuana and ecstasy, that causes withdrawal symptoms. Now this alcohol and tranquilizers, they produce the most severe type of most dangerous physical withdrawals symptoms. Okay, so when you suddenly stop taking alcohol and tranquilizers, these may lead to seizure, strokes or even heart attacks in high risk patients. Okay, so before stopping it, it is really required to detox before to minimize the withdrawal symptoms. Now talking about the different phases of withdrawal symptoms. So the first phase is actually the acute stage, which lasts usually for a few weeks. So this is characterized by a lot of physical withdrawal symptoms. Okay, and the second stage is the post acute stage, which lasts usually for months together, and this has fewer physical withdrawal symptoms but a lot of emotional and psychological withdrawal symptoms. So let us look at what are the different physical and emotional systems. So the four emotional withdrawal symptoms are anxiety, depression, sleep and cognitive disorder. Then the six physical withdrawal symptoms are headaches. When it happens in the head, it causes headaches and dizziness. In the chest tightening and difficulty in breathing. Then in the heart, it causes the heart to race or skip beats and palpitation. Then in the gastrointestinal tract, it causes nausea, vomiting, diarrhea and stomach aches. Okay, stomach ache is one of the most daunting physical withdrawal symptoms. Then muscle tension, muscle twitches, tremors, shaking, and then the skin actually would sweat and tingle. Okay. Now let's talk about medical detox. So this is the period of medically. So what happens basically in medical detox is, so this is achieved by pharmaceutical intervention. Okay, the patient who has to undergo this withdrawal symptoms, who is harboring withdrawal symptoms, has to take a lot of drugs to cope up with the different physical withdrawal symptoms. Okay, and then it often takes place in a residential inpatient rehabilitation center. Okay, so this can happen in a variety of settings. Okay, because this drug addiction is a chronic process, chronic disorder. So there are relapses, short term or one time treatment is usually not sufficient. Okay, and it might also long term rehabilitation might also involve multiple interventions. Now coming to drug treatment. So drug treatment includes the uses of actual drug and then behavioral therapy. Okay, so the treatment medicines include so for the different types of drugs available, there are different medications that are used, and then there are behavioral therapies that motivate people to participate in drug treatment more voluntarily. Okay, they offer strategies to cope up with drug cravings and teach ways to avoid drugs and prevent relapse. And then behavioral therapies can also improve communication, relationship and parenting skills. Now talking about drug rehabilitation. So usually patients are free to leave anytime. Okay, but it is effective only when the patient has a strong desire to stay and be committed to the course of the treatment. Then rehab and detox. So before entering a rehab facilities, patients undergo this detox treatment, which basically is the process where the body is forced to get rid of all the drugs or addictive substances in the body. And then there are rehabilitation facilities where actually patient make changes in their lives by rectifying the maladaptive behaviors. So whatever behavioral deficits they have, they compensated here. Okay, so they learn healthy coping skills, impulse control, regulation skills, and then drug refusal strategies that can help prevent relapse in the long term. Also these facilities are very specialized. For example, they help so some are very specialized for specific drugs, and then there are others which provide rehabilitation from a broad range of drugs. Some rehabilitation centers are even gender specific or age specific. And then there are inpatient and outpatient rehab facilities. So in the outpatient rehab facility, you can actually stay at home and just visit the rehabilitation center periodically. Okay, so with this we end the chapter health and diseases here. Thank you so much.